Welcome back to Chazin-the-Dream. I'm Ethan Chazin, excited to be your host for today's episode. And joining us today is David Friedman. And I asked David a while ago to join, and I'm really excited he'll be here today. So I want to give a little bit of background to David and then dive right in. Are you okay with that, sir?
Sounds great.
Wonderful. So David spent 27 years building and leading RSI, which became one of the most successful employee benefits consulting brokerage firms in the entire country. So during the 27 years of his leadership, they were recognized consistently 7 times, named one of the best places to work, 4 times, named one of the fastest growing privately held companies. Also, winner of New Jersey's highest award for quality, the Governor's Award for Performance Excellence, gold level. David sold RSI in 2008 and retired from the industry in 2010. But more than anything, and why I'm so excited to pick his brain today, RSI is known for its extraordinary organizational culture. And if you listen to any other episodes, you know we talk about culture around here. So in response to a lot of requests to pick his brain, in 2011, David wrote and published Fundamentally Different to explain how to create a high-performance culture through organizational values. We're going to talk about that a little bit based on the lessons that he learned and has taught throughout his career. Today, in addition to promoting the book and writing a lot of articles, he's a frequent speaker and a thought leader and a consultant dedicated to helping companies to achieve maximum success through their leadership and their cultures and their values. David, ready to go chasing the dream?
Absolutely. I'm happy to do it, Ethan.
Awesome. Awesome. So we talked before, and one of the things that you said that really struck me was just organically throughout your career, the success that was achieved at RSI. And I really want to just spend some time right at the get-go talking about what made RSI so successful.
Yeah, all of our success, Ethan, I tell people all the time, was based upon the culture that we built in that company. I learned early on that culture was everything. And we had this fantastic culture and a great group of people and a great leadership team. And the way that we worked together was all the difference. And it's interesting to me, like that was the first company I've ever worked with. So I'm one of those rare people that I never worked for anybody else in my life. I started there, built that company, never worked anywhere else. And so I used to say to people, in some ways that was an advantage, in some ways it was a disadvantage. And I should say as well that my educational background, for the benefit of your listeners, is that I was a philosophy major in school. So I had no business education and I had no business background, and I got into business. And I say often that that was an advantage and a disadvantage. The disadvantage was, of course, I knew nothing. The advantage, of course, was I knew nothing. And what that allowed me to do, and I say that, is it allowed me to just, I don't know, follow my instincts. That I had a pretty good instinct for leadership, and I wasn't saddled with notions about how other companies are run or how you're supposed to do things. And so I just did things that made sense to me. And fortunately, I had pretty
Like
good
what?
instincts.
And I'm going to jump in because, you know, common sense goes to die in corporations and,
It
the
seems
command
like
control
that,
structure.
which is
It
bizarre to
does.
me.
So
Yeah.
what would you say, just kind of brass tacks or
Yeah.
some of the kind of common sense things that not having that kind of developed business background innate freed you up to come in with that
Yeah.
almost different perspective, a
I would
philosophical.
so I would say most significantly, Ethan, it was the way that I learned to treat people. Now, and this is like so darn obvious, it's bordering on ridiculous and almost embarrassing, that when I would hear, and I still to this day, it just boggles my mind, when I hear people describe the way they were treated in other companies, when I hear people would come to our company and talk about how refreshing it was that they didn't have a leader yell at them.
Mhm.
And I thought, do people do that in company? Like adults yell at each other?
Throw
I mean,
shoes at each other.
yes, I heard people talk about throwing things. Like
Uh,
adults don't do that, do they? I have no picture of human beings treating each other like that. And so it was just bizarre to me. And I will tell you, even to this day, I was reading a book the other day. It's a book, an interesting book by a guy named Tim Spiker called "Who Not What," and it's basically the gist of what he says in this book is that having looked at lots and lots of leaders and done lots of research, that in the short version of this is that leaders who are healthy human beings, who are good people, who have high character, tend to be the kind of people want to follow, and that who they are as people matters more than even the skills that they have. I mean, that's a brief summary. But and in the book, he describes the kinds of dysfunction that is common in corporate America, or not in corporate America, just corporations around the world.
Right.
And as I read the descriptions of that kind of dysfunction, it just sounded so bizarre to me because that's not my experience. And I can't imagine, like, why would a leader do that? But if you're an insecure person, um, and you've got ego issues and other issues, I guess you do all kinds of stupid things. And so I treated people like humans. I respected them. I valued them. I trusted them, and gee, that seems like an obvious way to treat people. And they ended up performing at a much higher level. And I would say, if I were to point to one single thing that was probably more important than any other single thing, and there's lots of them. And this was something that I think I learned from my father originally, but just how my family operates and how we operate as a company, is that we check the ego at the door. And that means that we make the best decisions for the organization, and nobody's worried about who gets credit, who looks bad, who looks good. Nobody's worrying about positioning themselves and all the other junk that gets in the way of people just working together effectively. And so when you run an organization where egos aren't the driver, you free yourself up just to make good decisions and treat people well and do the things that make sense. And so I just did that. And that just seems like an obvious way to treat people. And we built an organization of people who cared about each other, who had tremendous pride in the quality of what they were doing, who cared deeply about delivering fantastic service to customers, and were not worried about getting credit for things, or who's to blame for things, because that's just not how we operate. And doing that enough, and you create a great company. So again, I hadn't been in the dysfunction of other companies to learn how to do that. So I just did what made sense to me.
Yeah, and the what made sense to you and the just do it naturally,
Yeah.
you
But what I
inherited
would say,
value.
yes. And what I would say, though, is significant in my career is that while I did and do have good instincts about leadership and organizational behavior and how to treat people in a certain way, I am by nature, and maybe this is my philosophy background, I am also very introspective or reflective. And so I would do things mostly that worked well intuitively. And then I'd stop and think, boy, that was interesting. I wonder why that works so well. Because there must be principles of leadership and principles of organizational behavior that are at play. I didn't know them when I was doing them. I was just being me. But they're operating here. And if I could stop and I could reflect upon why did what I just do work so well, and I could discern what some of those principles are, then I could start to articulate those, and I could start to teach them to the people around me. So over the course of my career, I've just built so much material around things that came intuitively to me, but my reflections about those and my thoughts about those. And I've organized so much of that into material that I've taught to so many thousands of others through books, talks, and other things. So almost everything I teach is very organic for me, but it's a result of experience and a lot of reflection.
So if somebody were to say to you,
Mhm.
David, I don't have that almost common sense approach, or I'm lacking in that opportunity to develop those skills. And I'm also not by nature introspective and reflective. How can I do what you say, which is, and you and I talked about this, your kind of interest and passion for making culture more concrete and applicable and something that can be practiced or modeled. How
Yes.
can you teach somebody who's not comfortable in this kind of environment to build that? Because as you said, you didn't just have that at RSI over 27 years. You built it day in and day out by checking the ego at the door.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, the foundation of everything that I teach is the recognition that the culture in any organization, I don't care whether it's your company, my company, whether it's a sports team, a family, a classroom, if you put a group of human beings together, the culture in that group of human beings has an enormous influence over everything that happens. And so my point of view, and this gets to your question, is okay, if we understand that that culture enormously influences how people do what they do, then
Mhm.
as a leader, I should be purposeful about creating the culture that I want instead of just hoping it's going to work out on its own. And when we talk about, okay, to your question, so how do you do that? How
Yeah.
do you actually go about doing that? To me, there are a lot of different steps to it. And in my first book, Fundamentally Different, and my second book, Culture by Design, I lay out a framework that I call the 8-step framework, 8 different things that you do these 8 things, this is how you pull it off. But if for the audience sake, if I just cut to the chase and get to, at the end of the day, there are 2 very simple things that drive probably 80 or 90% of the impact. And those 2 simple things are, number one, how we, this is going to sound really obvious, but it is, how we go about defining, well, what is the culture that we want in the first place? Now, I say this is obvious because how could I go about as a leader very intentionally building a particular culture if you can't tell me, well, what is the culture you're trying to create in the first place? I mean, that's
But
pretty
then, but
obvious.
then to your point, just kind of to be the
Yeah,
little voice, the voice of like oppositional viewpoint. You know,
sure.
David, we were so busy starting up and growing our business, we never really intentionally wanted or planned to design it. And therefore,
Yes,
this is what happened organically when we didn't
yes,
address it. So sorry,
yes.
but keep going. So
Yes.
yeah,
So,
you would think,
and I think
design it.
to your point, Ethan, that's what most often happens is people don't design it purposely and it happens organically. And when it happens organically, and this is important, the way it happens organically is it mostly gets influenced by the most dominant personalities in the group.
Huh.
And so and think about, this is true in any group of people. So even think about a group of friends. If you got a group of friends and there's a culture in that group, an unwritten set of rules about how the group operates together. In almost all cases, the most dominant personality in the group is the one who sets the tone for how we're going to do things. It's just the nature of their personality. Some are more leaders, some are more followers, and the leaders tend to set the stage of this is how we're going to do things. Well, the reason this is important to understand is that the same thing happens in companies, that if we're not purposely designing and implementing and creating the culture we want, the culture is getting created anyway. It's not like we don't have one. We have one.
Right,
And it's
right.
mostly getting created organically by the strongest personalities. Now, if the strongest personalities, and by the way, the strongest personalities aren't necessarily the designated managers, supervisors, and leaders. They're just people with strong personalities. And if those people happen to be wonderful, positive, enthusiastic, egoless, quality oriented kind of people, we'll have a great culture. But what if they're not? What if some of the stronger personalities happen to be cynical jerks with lousy attitudes? And we've all had jerks in our companies before, let's be honest. The jerks will influence the people around them to be more like them. And the reason this is such an important issue is, once again, if we understand the impact that the culture has on the organization and on its performance, well, we don't want to leave that to chance. We got to take control over that. And that's why that becomes so important. So to your point, most companies, especially when they're growing, they're just so busy working that nobody thinks about this stuff.
Right.
And then they end up organically with a culture that isn't particularly helpful. So my point of view is we don't want to leave that. We got to make that happen.
And you
And
say that there are two things that are
yes,
primarily responsible for driving. And so the first is to define in advance what it is that you want the culture to be. And so what
yes.
was the second thing?
Well, and just to go back on that for a moment, you used the phrase in advance. I wouldn't necessarily use that phrase only because some might hear that and think, well, it's too late for me. I already have a company. So no, wherever we are, we should right
Okay.
now, from wherever, I don't care, wherever the company is right now, as leaders, we need to say, I'm taking control of this thing. And the first thing I got to do is define what is the culture that I want to build. And we'll come back and I'll tell you how to do that, because how you do that is really important. And most companies don't do it very well. Even those that are intentional about their culture don't define it with enough clarity. And we've got to do that well. And I'll come back to that. But the second step in the overall framework for how to drive this is another very simple concept that I call creating rituals. Rituals are behaviors that we do over and over and over again so that they become baked in. You go to a ball game, we do the national anthem. When we were kids in school, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Some people say a prayer before a meal. They're just routines, habits, you might call them. And the reason that routines, rituals, habits are so important to success is that most people and most organizations are not very good. In fact, they stink at sticking with things. We come up with all kinds of wonderful ideas. We're all excited, and then life gets in the way and we get busy and it falls by the wayside. Exactly. Once it becomes a ritual, though, or a habit or a routine, whatever word you want to use, it's not hard to do. It becomes sustainable. So the way we use that simple concept is we take the culture, the defining of the culture, which I'll talk about in a moment. I suggest we define them in terms of behaviors, and behaviors are different than values, and we'll talk about that. But we define the behaviors that we want our culture to be, and then we focus on one every week through a series of rituals. So week number 1, everybody in the company is focused on the first behavior. Week number 2, everybody in the company is focused on the second. Week number 3 on the third, and so on. And at the end of the list, we go back to the beginning and we do it over and over and over and over and over again, so that the behaviors become internalized. And so in a really simple way of thinking about this, to me, culture is really defined by the behaviors of your organization. How do people do things in your company? So if we could define really clearly the way we want people to do things, and we could create a systematic, ritualized way to teach those behaviors to people, to teach and practice them over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, those behaviors that we want are going to become internalized in our people. That just makes sense. Like, why wouldn't that work? Of course that works.
But
And we
right,
just
it makes
develop a
common
system to
sense.
do that.
Yeah, and again, back to the question of me pushing back gently on the
Sure,
whole common
go
sense
for it.
thing, because we're
Yeah,
operating, when you say that, on an assumption that people use common sense in corporations or organizations. Can you provide an example for the person who's really grappling
yes,
with this concept of what might be a specific behavior that you ritualize to
sure.
achieve, to build culture as far as values? Like,
Right.
what are some examples of somebody going, oh, aha, I get it, David?
Yeah, so let me be careful about language here, because I'm picky about this because it's important. So in defining what we want our culture to be, I make a very big distinction, and it's a really important distinction, between what I call values and what I call behaviors. And I used to not think about this, but it's really important. So for your audience sake, a value to me is typically an abstract concept. So examples of values would be things like quality, integrity, respect, loyalty, passion, commitment, innovation, teamwork. These are ideas, concepts. A behavior, though, which is what I prefer, is an action. It's something that people do, that you can see somebody doing. So let me give you some examples. Some of the behaviors that I teach in my company are things like honor commitments. That's something you actually do. Practice blameless problem solving. Get clear on expectations. Be a fanatic about response time. Do what's best for the customer. These are actions that people do. And the reason that that distinction is really important is that values, though they look wonderful on the website and they sound really good and they look good on the wall, they're really hard to operationalize because they mean too many different things to too many different people. Behaviors, because they're action oriented, are a lot easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. So if we can define our culture, not necessarily in terms of the very stereotypical, big, broad vision, mission, values that everybody's got on their website, if we can, instead of that, we can define, well, what are the behaviors that you as a leader say, if we could get our people to do these things consistently, man, we'd be even more success than we've already been. Now we've got something we can sink our teeth into. Behaviors we can teach and coach and guide people about. And I give those behaviors a name, just it's my own name nomenclature. I call them fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. So the first thing is to define the fundamentals, the behaviors that drive success in your company. Now, you asked about an example of, so how do you ritualize that? So let me give you a really simple example that'll resonate for your audience. So one of the rituals that I do in my company, and actually every one of our clients does, is every time we have a meeting in our company, whether it's a project team meeting, a department meeting, a leadership meeting, a Zoom meeting. My current company is completely remote, so this works remote as well. Every meeting we do is on Zoom. If we have a meeting going on in our company this week, and we got lots of them, every single meeting in my company this week, the first agenda item of the meeting is the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first few minutes talking about it. So my fundamental in my company this week is one. So we take one every week and we scroll through them. And at the end of the cycle, we go back to the beginning. So my fundamental this week in my company is one that we call create win-win solutions. It's about looking for, how do I make sure that I understand what you need to get out of this? And how do I understand what I need to get? And can we craft a solution that we both get what we're looking for, instead of me just demanding, this is what I have to have? When we learn to think from that perspective, it's a much healthier place that leads to more success. So every meeting in my company this week, the first thing we do is we talk about creating win-win solutions. Next week, every meeting that we have, we talk about next week's fundamental. The week after that, that one. So the ritual is starting every meeting with the fundamental of the week. We apply that ritual to whatever fundamental we happen to be on this week as we cycle through them over and over again. And that gives us lots and lots of chances to teach and talk about, explore, and go deep on what this fundamental really means. And so if you just think about that simple idea, if we define really clearly the behaviors that drive success in our company, and we talk about them and work on them every single week over and over and over and over and over and over again, sooner or later, those behaviors are bound to become internalized in our people. That makes sense.
It does. And I'm hearing something as I kind of picture this modeling, where instead of these generic values, which are kind of esoteric, but
Yes.
really specific behaviors that are action driven, the
Yes.
reinforcing by repetition of them, and you said
Yes.
internalize. I'm hearing something else.
Go
I'm
ahead.
hearing that in your model, if I understand this correctly, you can then say that culture is how people behave in your
Absolutely.
organization. So that's what I'm hearing. If I want to make sure
Yes.
I capture that, culture is often given these weird definitions or nebulous. Culture in your model, because it's driven by behavior
Yes.
reinforcement. Culture is based on how people show up and how they act every day, what they do, and how they interact.
Yes. That's exactly right, Ethan. And
Okay.
what
Okay.
I would tell you about that, and your observation is important here, is that one of the reasons, in my experience, that most leaders don't know what to do about culture is the definition of culture. In other words, when we call culture all of this fluffy, wifty, amorphous kind of stuff, oh, it's the way people believe about things, and it's the way, it's this sort of, as long as we get all this fuzzy kind of stuff, I don't know what to do about any of that. As soon as we see culture as behavior, oh, I can do something about that. I mean, the model that I've just described is a very simple behavior change model.
Mhm.
People have been studying behavior change literally for thousands of years. This is nothing new. We've known about this stuff for thousands of years. So as long as we call culture all of that fluffy stuff, it paralyzes. I don't know what to do about it. As long as once we start to see culture through a behavior lens, oh,
Uh-huh.
that's not so hard. I can do something about that. That's why that definition is so critical.
Yeah, I think this is of many of the things you've shared with me previously, and I think what I'm hearing now today is really the critical importance of saying we want our organization's culture to be this. and defining it based on how people behave and act and treat each other, and therefore the reinforcement of it on a constant, consistent basis, the result is they internalize. Um,
That's exactly it.
and it makes so much more sense, especially once you said, as you just did, when you go from this nebulous kind of way of describing with values to this is how we want our people to behave and act and
Yes.
do.
Yes.
There's something else. The last thing I want to ask you, because I can talk about this forever, but I want to ask you something in some of your writings and
Mhm.
something you've mentioned to me before. You talk about health. You've
Yeah.
talked about organizational health. You talked about individual health. You've mentioned that the experiences you had throughout your career with your peers and having healthy relationships was instrumental. Um, can you talk a little bit about culture in terms of individual and collective health? And I ask only because we just came out not too long ago of a global pandemic. And I
Mm.
think a lot of organizations and a lot of people are still not willing to kind of, it happened before.
Mhm.
Can you share, yeah, I mean, is that a comfortable topic or should we shift off that?
Oh, I can talk about anything you'd like to talk about, Ethan. I'm good. There's nothing I'm uncomfortable with. So,
I'm really interested in your perspective on the health of your individuals as how they behave in organizations.
yeah. So I would say that when we look at our lives, I don't think we can separate our lives as here's who I am at work and here's who I am at home. That I'm what's the word I want to use? I'm an integrated human being. And I show up in the world as me. And that me shows up at work, it shows up at home, it shows up with friend relationships. It's just who I am. And so all of these things are interrelated. If I'm learning at work to practice blameless problem solving, or to be one of our fundamentals is called to listen generously, to be a more generous listener, or to assume positive intent, or to learn to speak straight and have honest conversations with people. If I'm doing that stuff at work, it's affecting how I am as a person. And if it's affecting how I am as a person, it's affecting how I am as a father, as a son, as a husband, as a friend. And it affects all aspects of me. And it's interesting that, and I think back to my first company, RSI, where we created all this stuff and practiced our fundamentals for so many years. I had so many employees who would say to me, and I hear this from our clients as well, that practicing fundamentals had an enormous influence on their personal lives, that they were better husbands and wives and sons and daughters and fathers and mothers, that they were better human beings because they were practicing this stuff that just made them better people wherever that showed up in their lives. And that's just a good thing for us. And we know, I'm talking about health in a sort of emotional, psychological
Yeah,
way,
yeah.
but we know that mind-body connection is strong. And so that has to affect our physical health as well. When I'm a more sound person, when I lack ego, when I am more focused on serving other people, I'm just going to I'm going to be physically healthier. I'm going to be emotionally healthier. I'm going to be more successful in my relationships, and I'm going to be a better contributor at work. It affects all parts of our lives. And so why wouldn't we want our people to be that way? And going back to where we started this entire conversation about, the effectiveness of my first company. So just think about it this way. If I've created a group of people who work together, who enjoy each other, who invest in relationships with each other, who check their ego at the door, who love to serve others, who take pride in the quality of their work, who love to support each other as teammates. It wouldn't be a big leap of faith to think, I have a suspicion that company would probably perform better in the marketplace and make more money and be more successful. That, of course, they would, because they're doing their job function better and
Right.
taking pride in that. Of course, that would lead to more success, which is why I say from the very beginning, it's just unfathomable. I can't understand why one would not do those things. Like if leading in a dysfunctional way is not fun, it causes stress and anxiety for everybody around you and reduces the performance of the company from an economic standpoint. Why would somebody do that? And yet we talked about the people that throw things and yell and scream and do all kinds of other bizarre kinds of behaviors. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
I could go on and I likely would, except I don't think there's any other more appropriate time to kind of say that which you just said is a really critical way to end this conversation, in terms of pursuing a more humanistic approach
Hmm.
to creating a culture driven by people. And that's kind of where I'd like to end it. But I do want to ask before I let you go, David, if somebody
Sure.
wanted to say, I heard everything you said, and we're not where you are. And we need to kind of pick your brain on how to create or set a culture, define a culture driven by positive human behaviors and interactions. How would they reach you? What's the best
Yeah.
way to get in touch with you to have that conversation?
Yeah, two ways. One is best way to reach me is through my website, CultureWise, the word culture, W-I-S-E, culturewise.com is the website. My email is david@culturewise.com. And my last book really goes deep on how to do this. And that book is called Culture by Design. And it's on Amazon in all forms. So if you just look up Culture by Design, you'll see it there.
And for anybody who says, wait, I didn't catch that, I'm going to put all of that great information down below. So check out the video, listen to what David said, replay this a few times. You can skip over what I said, but listen to everything that David said. These are kind of the nuggets of truth, David, which is what I really appreciate you coming on and sharing, is your nearly 30 years of experience with this. Because a lot of people are struggling now. They're hearing about culture. They think it's important. They just don't know how to get there. They don't know how to build a healthy roadmap. So thank you so much for coming on the program today. It's greatly appreciated.
Totally my pleasure, Ethan. Glad to be able to participate with you.